The challenge of Nigeria as a free state in 20th century Africa is the need to revive the stature of man in Africa and restore the dignity of man in the world. Nigerians believe passionately in the fundamental human rights. We regard all races of the human family as equal. Under no circumstance shall we accept the idea that the black race is inferior to any other race.
In 1960, Nigeria was born. Independent, proud, a giant of Africa. Rich in land, rich in oil, and rich in promise. Across the world, people watched with hope. Here was a country with over 250 ethnic groups, 3 major regions, and a vision to unite them under one flag. The British were gone, the colonizers had left. Now the future belonged to Nigerians. But just 6 years later, on a cold night in January, soldiers moved through the darkness with rifles and orders. By dawn, Nigeria's first prime minister was dead. Top politicians were executed, the government had collapsed, and everything changed. This is the story of a coup that broke Nigeria. How a young country full of promise descended into chaos, how ethnic suspicion poisoned the army, how civil war followed, and how military rule became the new normal.
We must jealously guard our freedom with our lives if need be. I have made up my mind to do all that lies in my power so that our newly won freedom shall endure.
Nigeria began life as a federal republic, with power divided among 3 major regions. The north, dominated by the Hausa-Fulani, conservative and Muslim. The west, home to the Yoruba, urbanized and politically active. The east, led by the Igbo, ambitious and outward facing. Each region had its own government, its own press, and often its own agenda. At the center sat a fragile alliance. Ahmadu Bello led the north but stayed in Kaduna. His ally Tafawa Balewa became prime minister in Lagos. Azikiwe served as president, a ceremonial role with no power. But underneath this structure, the fault lines were cracking. Elections were rigged, especially in the west. Corruption spread like wildfire, and politicians stoked tribal loyalties to win power. And Nigeria's oil, newly discovered, became both a blessing and a curse. By 1965, chaos ruled the western region. Bodies were found on roadsides. Political violence had become the routine. In the north, fear grew that the south wanted to dominate. And in the east, resentment built over being shut out of federal appointments. Nigeria was independent, but it was not yet a nation. It was a house divided, and the army was watching. And some of its young officers were preparing to act. In the early hours of January 15, 1966, a group of young army officers moved under the cover of the night. They were mostly majors, mostly Igbo, and they called themselves revolutionaries. Their leader was a certain Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu, a 29-year-old, intelligent, radical, and deeply disillusioned by the corruption tearing Nigeria apart. To them, this wasn't a coup, it was a rescue mission. A plan to purge the 10%ers and corrupt elite who had hijacked independence. But what followed wasn't a cleansing, it was bloodshed. The Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa was kidnapped and later found dead in the bush. Ahmadu Bello, the Premier of the North, was assassinated in his home in Kaduna. Samuel Akintola, the Premier of the West, was shot in Ibadan. Brigadier Zakaria Malari, Colonel Kur Mohammed, and other top northern officers were gunned down in Lagos. In the east, however, no key leaders were killed. Nnamdi Azikiwe was out of the country, Michael Okpara, the Premier of the East, was untouched, and most of the plotters were Igbos. The coup was crushed in Lagos by loyalist troops, but in Kaduna, Nzeogwu had already taken over the region. Confusion reigned, and everyone was asking the question, who was in charge? Was this a failed coup or a successful assassination plot? To restore order, the army stepped in, and just like that, Nigeria's first democratic experiment ended with bullets. In a moment, the dream of democracy collapsed. The army, once silent, was now in charge. But the way the coup unfolded, the ethnic imbalance, the selective killing, and the Igbo dominance planted a deadly seed. In the north, it didn't look like a national revolution, it looked like an Igbo conspiracy. And the hunger for revenge was already beginning to rise. After the first coup, the army stepped in to restore order. The man who emerged as the head of state was Major General Johnson Agui Ironsi, an Igbo officer, respected, eloquent, and seen as a steady hand. But in the eyes of many northerners, this was salt on an open wound. Ironsi refused to punish the January coup plotters. He called it a mutiny, not a conspiracy. And worse, he surrounded himself with mostly Igbo advisors. And then came Decree number 34, the Unification Decree. It abolished Nigeria's federal structure and replaced it with a centralized system. To northerners, this confirmed their worst fears. The Igbos had killed our leaders, seized power, and now they were trying to dominate Nigeria completely, they said. The response was swift and bloody. On July 29, 1966, just 6 months after the first coup, northern officers, including Murtala Mohammed, Theophilus Danjuma, and Martin Adamu, struck back. This time, it was a purge. They captured General Ironsi in Ibadan, along with his host, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Fajui, a Yoruba officer who refused to abandon him. Both men were beaten, tortured, and executed. But the killings didn't stop there. Across the barracks in Lagos, Abeokuta, Kano, Kaduna, Igbo officers were hunted down. Many were executed on sight. Soldiers took their tribal anger beyond the army and into the street. It was no longer just a coup. It had become an ethnic massacre. In the chaos, a new leader emerged, a 31-year-old officer from Plateau State. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, but the East was watching. The massacres of their people, the execution of their generals, the silence of the new government. To many Igbos, Nigeria was no longer safe. They began to leave the north in droves, heading back east with stories of slaughter and betrayal. And in Enugu, a new voice was rising, a voice that will say enough. By late 1966, Nigeria was not a nation. It was a war zone of the mind. Tens of thousands of Igbos fled the north, their homes burnt down, families slaughtered. In Enugu, the capital of the east, Lieutenant Colonel Odomegu Ojukwu took control of the wounded people. He demanded justice, he demanded autonomy, he demanded safety for his people, or a new country. But the federal government refused. Negotiation collapsed. And on May 30th, 1967, Ojukwu declared the Republic of Biafra.
If civil war comes, and I do think it is imminent, you're quite right, it will for us be the price of freedom.
To the east, it was liberation. To Lagos, it was treason. On July 6, 1967, Nigerian troops invaded the east. The civil war had begun. The war lasted 2.5 years. Battles were fought in Nsukka, Owerri, Aba, and Onitsha. Biafran soldiers, under-equipped, outnumbered, fought with just their sheer resolve. Nigeria, backed by Britain and the Soviet Union, had tanks, planes, and oil money. But the real tragedy happened off the battlefield. The Nigerian government blockaded Biafra. No food, no medicine, and no aid. Famine swept through the land like a plague. The world watched in horror. The Red Cross came in, international journalists reported, but nothing stopped the dying.
I have got nothing to hide. My conscience is clear. I've got moral standard. God knows that we have no intention whatsoever to starve any Biafran children or to commit genocide against anybody. This war was forced on us, and it has got to be fought for the sake of the country, for the sake of the millions of people in this country.
By January 1970, Biafra could no longer fight. Its people were broken, its soldiers starved, its leaders were exhausted, and Ojukwu fled the country. Biafra surrendered. General Gowon declared no victor, no vanquish. But the wounds were deep and the silence was loud. The civil war ended, but Nigeria will never be the same again. Unity had been forced with bullets, trust had been buried under mass graves, and behind it all, the army remained in power. When the civil war ended in 1970, Nigeria had paid a heavy price. Over 2 million people were dead, tens of billions in economic losses, and a generation raised in trauma. But the war had done something else. It had cemented the military's grip on power. The army was no longer a temporary caretaker. It had become the government. And so, for the 33 years of the first 39 years of independence, the country was ruled by men in uniform. General Yakubu Gowon ruled from 1966 to 1975, Murtala Mohammed ruled from 1975 to 1976, and Olusegun Obasanjo ruled from 1976 to 1979. Then a short break for a democracy, and back to soldiers again. Buhari from 1983 to 1985, Babangida from 1985 to 1993, and Sani Abacha from 1993 to 1998. And what did the military rule leave behind? Under military rule, elections were cancelled, constitution was suspended, judges were ignored, civilians were silenced, and oil wealth flowed so abundantly, not to the people. It funded the lavish lifestyle, foreign bank account, and bloated state contracts. Corruption became institutionalized, power became centralized, and public trust evaporated. Military regime crushed activism, clamped down on the press, and introduced a culture of impunity. A nation built to be a democracy was trained to obey commands. By the time that democracy returned in 1999, Nigeria had changed. Yes, there were elections. Yes, civilians wore abadas instead of uniforms, but the deeper habits of top-down control, ethnic division, and institutional decay remained. Today, courts still wait for others. The police are often feared more than the criminals, and federalism is shallow. National unity is fragile. Why? Because the foundations cracked in 1966, and no one rebuilt it. The first coup did more than change leaders. It rewired Nigeria's DNA, from ballot to bullet, from trust to terror, from nationhood to survival. The coup of January 15, 1966 began as a rebellion against corruption, but it became the trigger for everything Nigeria has struggled with ever since. It broke the promise of civilian rule, it poisoned ethnic trust, it bled the nation into war, and it invited the military into the soul of the state. What it left behind is not just history, it is a scar, still fresh, still deep. A political class trained in manipulation, not service, a public used to silence, not accountability, institutions that crumble at pressure, citizens who see tribe before they see nation. The coup that broke Nigeria didn't just end the government, it broke the dream that Nigeria could be different. But maybe, in telling this story, in remembering what happened, we can start to understand where the real rebuilding must begin. Not just in Abuja or in Lagos, but in memory, in history, and in truth. To heal Nigeria, we must first remember what broke her. This is the first coup that broke Nigeria. Thank you for watching this episode. If you enjoyed this video, I highly recommend you watch our series, Nigeria's Whitewashed Head of State. It is a story of Nigerian leaders from 1966 to 1993. Thank you so much. Until I see you again, bye-bye.